thank you everyone for making time to be here. It's great to be part of this conversation and the bigger conversation that is planned to happen. I recognize and know some of the names who are following on from me. And indeed, I'm working with some of those groups and people, so it's great to see. And I just wanted to start off from more of a generalist approach than a specific approach on this, and really keep it at a higher level about conservation and agriculture. Starting off with the long-time situation of, are we opposition or are we allies? So when I grew up as a child, I was definitely told that you couldn't be a farmer and an environmentalist. That wasn't possible, and we were in conflict with each other. This was, however, a little confusing for me, as my uncle was both, and I grew up on the same farm as him, and he practiced what we call regenerative agriculture 50 years ago on that farm. But then I went to university, and my formal education confirmed that early message. I studied agriculture, and we couldn't work together. We were in conflict. But years later, I've now come around to realizing, and thanks in large part to my uncle and his influences, that in order for future farmers to survive, they have to be both. They have to be both environmentalists, conservationists, and farmers. So it all becomes about your perspective, about how you look at things. And if we look, for instance, in a beautiful Kalahari veld scene, if you look at the camelthorn tree growing amongst your veld, if you look at it as competition for the moisture with your veld, or alternatively, if you look at it as a nutrient pump and a source of shade. And the same can be said for termites, that those harvested termites that are gathering at dry periods all the remaining organic matter on the surface and taking it away. Well, are they a competition for your grazing animals? Or are they actually functioning as dryland earthworms and feeding your soil with the organic material they take down into the ground? And then the same with fire. Is fire the only management tool you have for managing your grass veld, which is often the case? Or do you have a range of tools available to you for managing and interacting with your grass veld? So it all comes down to your relationship with your ecosystem, the ecosystem that you live and interact with as a farmer. And you need to look at that and decide whether it's one of conflict or one of cooperation. And the reality is that if it's one of conflict, then the ecosystem of your farm, and as I will point out shortly, the economics of your farm, is in a downward spiral. So we've had this scenario of battering heads against each other. But the reality is that farmers touch somewhere between 50 and 60% of the land that we live on the planet. And if they're in control of that much land and impacting that much land, we really don't have any choice but to work with them, because any bigger picture in terms of preservation or conservation is ultimately going to be doomed. And today, this is not a unique insight from myself. Many of the world's leading conservation organizations now have agricultural desks and interact closely with agriculture. So for me, in my regenerative agriculture world, soil is the core of everything. And soil is also what conservationists and farmers have in common. This is a sign that was up on a farm, a co-op in South Dakota. Despite all our accomplishments, we owe our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And that's true for farmers and conservationists. And the scary thing about that 6 inches of topsoil, it is that it's so easily disturbed and degraded by us. We interact with it every day and we can really mess it up. And it is crucially important because it is not just about growing our food, it is central to so many processes that regulate our planet and create a planet that we can all live on. So if you look at soil, just to mention a few, there's the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. And they all have a significant part of their cycle that goes through the soil. And if we destroy the soil, well, then they all fade away. And without those things, well, there's no life as we know it. So then we need to ask ourselves, if this soil is so important, well, how are we doing when it comes to engaging with it? As you can tell from the picture I've chosen, I don't think particularly well. And that picture is an equally sad story. So the human race is not doing brilliantly. Every year, 45 billions of tons is lost. That's such a big figure, we can't really comprehend it. South Africa, it's 13 tons per hectare per annum. It is our largest export, and that is the case for many countries. If we had to work it out in terms of how much maize we produce, we lose 3 tons of soil for every 1 ton of maize that we make. You don't have to be a soil scientist to work out that that's not a great equation. In the Free State, in this process of losing the soil, we have lost an enormous amount of carbon from the soil. Originally, the carbon in much of the Free State was around 3%. Today, if your average cultivated lands, it's around 0.5%. And yet, less than 15% of the Free State practices no-till today. And we're living on an infinite planet, but we're behaving as if it can carry on forever and we can carry on consuming this soil. And the defense that industrial agriculture gives us for this behavior is that it's the only way we can feed the world. That doesn't really make sense, though, because we're not going to be able to feed them for long if it's not sustainable. And so let's challenge and have a look at those stats of theirs. The UN says that 70% of people are fed by food from small farms. In Africa, that's probably closer to 80%. So looking at that big industrial production, the United States is the world's biggest corn producer. They produce, in a very subsidized way, about 1/3 of the world's corn production. But less than 15% goes to human consumption. The largest portion is used to produce ethanol to add to their petrol. And that equation is sadly an energy negative equation, but still year after year, this regulation that causes that to happen persists. So I think if we just took that away from the United States corn production, well, we'd get 42% of that land area to produce food for people. Now we live in a carbon world. And I mentioned carbon briefly as the loss of it in the Free State. And we have become hyper-focused on carbon. If you were involved in agriculture 2 decades ago, no agronomist and no scientist would mention the word carbon on your farm. Today it comes up very early in the conversation. And carbon, however, has always been very important. It's much more about climate change. It's actually the backbone of life. We human beings are 18% carbon. And in terms of the soil, it is the currency of the plant-soil relationship. It drives that relationship, and that relationship is crucial in driving all those cycles that I mentioned. And so we need to get all that carbon that we've taken out of the soil and put in the sky and put it back in the soil so that our soil can function properly once again. Soil is a living entity, but our repeated interaction with it results in it dying and becoming dirt. We can quite easily return carbon back to the soil. We initially thought that carbon returned to the soil by the breakdown of residue on the surface of the soil of plant matter, leaves, branches, etc., that broke down and the soil food web took back into the soil. But we now know that that's a small percentage of the organic matter in the soil, and it's a very labile percentage. It moves, it cycles very quickly. The main source is actually via photosynthesis, via the roots of plants. And the plants send that carbon, they capture it from the sky, they use photosynthesis to make it into energy, and they send that energy out of the roots, buying minerals and water from the soil biology and using that carbon-based energy in order to trade. And that really is the source and the way we can get carbon rapidly back into the soil. But our industrial methods of farming do not work with us on this. One thing we often hear claimed, and I think it's a very dangerous claim, and we need to put it out there right in the beginning: agriculture cannot solve climate change. Climate change cannot be solved by any one sector of our economy or our society or the planet. It needs to be a collective effort. If every square centimeter of the planet was farmed regeneratively and we carried on putting as much fossil fuels into the sky as we currently are, the situation would not be solved. And it is, however, able to solve large parts of the problems that we face. For me, really, I think about it as as environmental collapse rather than climate change as being our primary thing that agriculture needs to engage with and that conservation needs to engage with. And this has three important parts for me: desertification, which is a crisis all over the planet, biodiversity collapse, and then the third leg of that being climate change. And although agriculture cannot solve climate change, we cannot solve any of those problems without getting agriculture into the game with us to help us solve those problems. So when we put our carbon back in our soil, it comes back to life. And then those all-important cycles return. And with cycles come ecosystem services. Now, this is what I really want to focus on now is ecosystem services. We often heard them mentioned of as something that landowners offer society as a whole. And these ecosystem services, they come with any parcel of land. They are benefits that are derived from nature, and they don't just accrue to greater society. The primary beneficiary of those ecosystem services is, of course, the landowner. Now, all of the ecosystem services are integrally linked with our soil and our soil health. And as our soil health deteriorates, so too do the ecosystem services. When we mine the soil rather than farm it, we lose the services. So what are ecosystem services? Well, one of the biggest is water, the capacity of soil to take water in, the capacity of soil to hold water, the capacity of soil to slowly release that water into streams, cleansing it before it does so. The carbon sequestration that happens from the environment, and the cleaning of our air, taking out of impurities and returning oxygen for all of us to breathe. It also, as you saw through those cycles, contributes to a stable climate, nutrient supply to all of the plants, biodiversity of the planet, crucial pollination for both all the plants of the planet, including food, and then the most obvious of all the ecosystem services, food. So that's just to mention a few to get people to look at what I'm talking at. And as I said, this is not just about creating a stable environment for us. It is crucial for our farm economics, because those ecosystem services provide food, provide water retention, provide all of those services for free. You don't have to buy them. And when you do destroy them, you then have to go to the co-op and then buy expensive external inputs to replace them. And those inputs are becoming more and more expensive as energy becomes scarcer and scarcer and more expensive. So just to give a quick insight into this, how we deal with this. I mentioned earlier the Free State row cropping. Well, when tractors arrived, the carbon was 3%. We've lost 80% of it. And today there's massive soil eroding away all over the Free State. And as a result, the soil of those fields is not giving those farmers any ecosystem services. The soil has been reduced purely to just a medium that holds the plants that the farmers are growing. If we look at a totally different system, a Karoo extensive grazing system, arid environment, human beings can't live without water. So if you go back 120 years ago when there were no boreholes and no windmills in the Karoo, and you look at all the farms and the towns, and there were a lot of houses and farms across the Karoo 120 years ago, they all had perennial water because humans wouldn't be able to live there if they didn't. Today there's zero perennial surface water in the Karoo. Our watersheds, primarily due to severe overgrazing, have been broken, and there is almost no water infiltration. Most of the water just runs off, and there is no baseline supply of water. And so once again, no ecosystem services. So looking at this farm economics in a quick graphic way, our business as usual approach leads to declining soil health. So over time, your soil gets worse, and as a result, your income earning potential of that soil drops. This, of course, is met with increased input costs, the increase in the price of diesel, the price of fertilizer, and the price of all the chemicals. And that ultimately results in economic failure. So this is something that we need to focus on. If we look at our current agricultural system, the dominant system, industrial agriculture, it is basically a war on soil and a war on ecosystem services. So if you are a farmer in Southern Africa, the future is full of difficulties and risk, because these losses in ecosystem services and the associated climate change, biodiversity loss, and the declining soil health are creating a whole mixture of problems that farmers have to face that farmers 50 years ago did not have to face at the same level. And so unless farmers move towards practices that restore ecosystem services and decrease their need for external inputs, their systems are going to crash. And there is only one way that you can restore ecosystem services and decrease your need for external inputs, and that is by placing the soil at the center of your agricultural planning. I've spoken briefly of regenerative agriculture, so just as a quick introduction, I'm sure many people know this, but at the risk of boring you, it's really all about 5 principles of soil health. There is no specific definition of regenerative agriculture, but if you reduce it to its basics, at the core, there lie these 5 principles of soil health, and it's all about keeping soil biology healthy or bringing it back. The first one is minimum disturbance. Don't drag large pieces of metal through their homes. Don't spray their homes with poisons and chemicals, and don't use monocultures, which is a biological disturbance of that soil. All of those things, which are common practices, all really disturb our soil and cause soil biology to be killed. Then our farming practices also leave our soil bare for most of the year. We produce a summer maize crop or a winter wheat crop, and for the rest of the year, that soil just sits there being baked by the sun, blasted by the wind, and occasionally beaten by the rain. And so we need to work on keeping the soil covered to give it a blanket. Most of our farms have very simple rotations, if any rotations at all, and very few of them use cover crops at all. And so by doing that, we can vary the diet of the soil. The biological diversity above ground impacts incredibly on the diversity below ground. And what is in fact delivered to those soil microbes under the ground from the roots of the plant. At the moment, we pretty much feed them cornflakes for breakfast, cornflakes for lunch, cornflakes for supper, and we do that 7 days a week, 52 days of the year. So we need diversity both above and below ground. As I said, the main way we get energy into the ground is via the roots of plants, photosynthesis, feeding out sugars from plants. And if we're only going to have a crop in our field for 4 months of the year, and it's really only growing well for 3 months of those 4 months, well, then we're really only feeding that soil biology for 4 months of the year. And that makes that soil biology go into hibernation and die very quickly in the off season, the bare fallow, as we used to call it. And then the final move, the final principle is to incorporate livestock. Now, all farms used to have livestock on them. Ecosystems don't really function without animals in them. And what happened when we invented fertilizer was that we replaced the livestock function of stimulating the ecosystem of the soil with the fertilizer, and ultimately the animals were placed into feedlots and on concrete. And in the process, we created two problems. We created a fertility problem on the farm and a pollution problem in the feedlot. So we need to get the animals back onto the farms and get a connection once again between the ruminant, the microbes of the ruminant of the animal and the microbes of the soil, and to get plant material and break it down and bring it into moist contact with the soil so that that soil food web and that cycling can happen at the required rate. So that's just a brief introduction to regenerative agriculture. If we practice these things, we can put the carbon back in the soil, and this can happen remarkably quickly. You can go in the Free State from 0.5% back up to 3% in about 8 years, 8 to 10 years. It can be done. You can fix those broken cycles, return water cycles, reinstate, in many cases, the small water cycle, which has been entirely broken. We can add diversity to so many parts of the planet by farming in this way that brings diversity back, and bring environmental resilience to farms. When we have those climate change impacts, those 4 weeks of no rain in the middle of the rainy season, well, the farms are more resilient because the soil's holding more water, and things can perform much more effectively. And the great news is, as I said, it recovers remarkably quickly. We just got to stop killing it. And once we stop killing it and work with it, well, then it recovers, and with it, the ecosystem services return. Stabilize our environment, and we regenerate our farm economics. So that was the graph that I showed you earlier. And what we want to do is improve our soil health, decrease our input costs, and improve our economics, and get farms to move off that spiral, that downward spiral that is depicted by the business as usual red graph, and up onto the rising green graph. So in conclusion, farmers have to work with the environment going forward from here. There really is no choice. Conservationists need to work with farmers, and wider society needs to invest in the restoration of primary agriculture. For we are all intertwined with this together. We are connected by the soil. We are connected by the ecosystem services of the soil, and we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very short story about soil, because I know that soil can, and stories about soil can go on for hours and hours and hours and still be thrilling to the very end. So this really was put very succinctly and very well. And we do have quite a few questions coming in. I'm going to be asking these questions in the chat in no specific order right now. But if anybody wants to ask their own question, please, even if you've written it in the chat, please raise your hand and we will see it in the video panel, and we will unmute you and ask your question. So we have one from Richard that's come in. How best to monitor soil health? Do we do that using microfauna, macrofauna, SOC? How would you decide, Andrew?
Well, yeah, I mean, soil is a very complex thing. There's biology, there's the physical side, and then there's the chemistry side. And what we've done for decades is forget about the biological side, and that needs to come front and center. But sadly, that requires a lot of specific knowledge to understand, and a microscope and various things. But there are nice, very simple tests for telling if a soil is healthy. And what I like about these tests is that they don't need a third party. You don't need to pay anyone else to do this. We can all do it on any piece of land that we work with at any time. I'm not saying that you shouldn't, if you're planning on farming, do proper soils tests, and that includes chemical and biological tests, but just in terms of interacting with soil. And I think one of the most important is the infiltration test. The impact of the difference of a dead soil, a compacted dead soil, in terms of water infiltration, it can be so bad, the health of the soil, the biological health, that it can actually repel water. You know, you put the water on and it looks like mercury running around on top of the soil rather than soaking in like into a sponge or a cloth. And so by getting a simple metal pipe, and it needs to be about that long, you hammer it into the ground, you pour in a certain amount of water, and you measure how long that takes to infiltrate. You can get an infiltration rate for your soil, and then you can compare different soils around the area. So if you take a field that's about to be plowed and you do that infiltration test on it, and then you do the same test on the soil under a fence row that hasn't been plowed and hasn't been farmed and hasn't been tilled for years, you will find that the infiltration rate is multiples, like probably 8 times as fast underneath the fence. And that is a test. You can search on YouTube how to do it more clearly than I've just described, but it's a test any of us can do. Then the other thing is just to feel your soil, to feel and look at it and sense the aggregation. Is it aggregate? Is it beach sand sliding through your fingers in individual pieces? Or does it clump together? Or is it a solid rock? And then the third test is the smell test. Soil is a living thing. It smells. And we all know what compost smells like. And at the other end of the scale, you've got dirt, lifeless soil, which go to the beach or a riverbank, pick up that. It doesn't smell of anything. It's entirely odorless. And so that lovely, rich, humic smell that you can get from the soil. So to do an infiltration test, to feel, to be able to dig into a soil with your hands, and to smell your soil are 3 tests any human can do anywhere on the planet for free with instant results. And they really are great tests. Yeah, and then as I said, there is a multitude more you can do with soil testing, but it all costs money and time, and you generally have to get in a third party to help you.
Thank you, Andrew. That answers it very nicely indeed. Now, Dixon, who is in Kenya, has not really a question, but I'm going to reform it into a question. This whole carbon credit business that is, has been going on for many years and is, a huge part of some people's income. How closely do you think this should be focusing on agricultural soil health?
Well, you shouldn't be able to be earning carbon credits if your agricultural soil health is not improving. So the way the carbon credit setup is done is you're supposed to change your practices, which is called additionality, and that results in an improvement in carbon sequestration and organic matter in your soil, and then that results in your soil health improving. So they should be coupled together. And I am aware right now there are a large number of organizations that are wanting to do satellite-based carbon monitoring. I personally don't see how that can function. We actually need to interact with the soil. We've got to see the soil, see what practices are being implemented on the soil, see how the soil is changing, and that needs to be included in any carbon measurement that you're doing. Yeah, I mean, I see carbon as part one of ecosystem services. Ultimately, I think we need to get to a stage, agriculture represents about 3% of the global GDP, okay? And in most countries, it's somewhere around there at 3%. Some are more industrialized, others are not, but somewhere around there. So what that says is that 96% of the world's economy, 97% of the world's economy is not involved in agriculture. But we need this massive restoration of ecosystem services in agriculture. And that 96% has to invest some money in the restoration of that land. And I think we need to work on a suite of ecosystem services that the landowners can earn to complement their food, because the world has got so used to cheap food, and it's cheap food, only cheap because we don't pay for the pollution that it produces while we make it. And so we're so used to cheap food that if we have to pay the true cost of food, we rebel and we throw our hands up and say, this is ridiculous. So if we want to carry on having cheap food, then we need to find another way to pay for the production of that food, and we must pay for the ecosystem services that we don't destroy in the production of that food. So sorry, I got a bit distracted there, but carbon must definitely be tied to soil.
No, that was very nicely put. Thank you, Andrew. Now, we have a question here from Mark. Mark, I'm going to ask it, but Marette, if you could unmute Mark, because I'm sure he will have an answer to your answer, Andrew. So, Andrew, Mark would like to know how much of the current farming practice is actually based on politically motivated policy decisions, things like biofuels, which you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's different in different countries, but, let's take the United States is always easy to throw arrows at and darts at because it's the industrial agriculture poster boy. But there's this bizarre situation where you can get crop insurance, but you can only get crop insurance if you apply all the chemicals. If you don't apply all the chemicals in the way that your local agronomist suggests you should, then you don't get the crop insurance. And then you add that sort of practice to the biofuels, to the protection in both the United States and Europe of farmers via tariffs and trade, et cetera, and then the massive use of subsidies. I mean, politics is rife in our agriculture, and it's less so in African countries. I live here in South Africa. Under apartheid, there was a lot of support for large commercial farmers by the erstwhile government, but that totally ended at the end of apartheid. But still, international politics impacts the way we farm on the ground here in South Africa, no doubt, and it definitely hinders the advance of natural farming systems.
Mark, over to you.
I think this is thank you first of all for the presentation and the answer. And I guess it's difficult to discuss this in this format because it is a long conversation. I mean, you mentioned feedlots, for example, earlier. And to the extent that, for example, livestock farming cannot rely on, let's say, environmentally sensible pasture, but has to add feedlots, you get a very from an energy point of view, an extremely inefficient system that puts huge pressure on the environment as well. So you have a lot of consumer choices that play a role. You've got the political decisions on biofuels, depending on which country you're in, obviously. You've got international trade issues going on. But, it should all remind us that I think in the Ukrainian situation, more than half of the wheat that was delivered from Ukraine ended up as fuel in cars. And so the food, there is no real priority on healthy foods with high food security and healthy soils. It's essentially a system that seems to be just relying on exploiting ecosystem services, as you pointed out, in just one direction. And we exploit these ecosystem services pretending that they don't cost anything. But they obviously do, as you also pointed out. So sorry, this is not a question, it's more a statement, and I'll just be quiet for now.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the feedlot system, I mean, basically, one of the things about the feedlot system is at the age of 9 months, the animal leaves a farm and ends up in a feedlot, okay? So it basically no longer a natural process. The whims of nature are no longer involved in that. And it then becomes a factory process, and as a result is able to produce constantly a very consistent product throughout the year. And that becomes very hard for non-feedlot farmers to compete with. Now, those feedlots have managed to turn this whole thing around, the feedlot industry, and say that this is what the consumer is demanding. They're demanding this white fat, very tender, almost, in my opinion, tasteless beef. And that's what we have to give the consumer. And that's not the case. I mean, the consumer was changed by the creation of the feedlots. The feedlots weren't demanded by people. The feedlots came into being because we produced excess grains for the first time in our history, and we had the technology to make it happen, and we need to get rid of those grains and use them for something. But then suddenly the retailers loved it because now they had this constant supply. They could do, to use a different crop, strawberries 365 days of the year. And it was amazing. And so it's a very difficult system to undo. And all of these things, there's so many crossovers. And so you've got the massive biofuel lobby, and that lobby is pushing at government, and they are doing a lot of presentation about how they are so much better for the environment. You've got the natural gas people presenting that they are better than coal. It's very complicated, Mark. Yeah. Very, very complicated, but we just got to slowly chip away at it.
It is, and I think one of your comments is, that agriculture is an intensely political activity, but I think so too is conservation in many, many aspects. So again, that brings that similarity close. Now, Brigitte wanted to ask about agricultural practices and how closely are they related to the Bayer Monsanto profit model that is driving the political agenda. Now, I asked that without having any understanding of what she's saying. So maybe there's others like me in the room, and maybe you can elaborate on what she's talking about and then answer her question.
Yeah, I mean, so the industrial agricultural model, it basically began with the mass production of fertilizer after World War II. So we took the technology of making gunpowder that had been pushed to new capacity and new efficiencies by the war, and turned that all over to fertilizer production, and suddenly produced this massive excess food for the first time in the history of the world. And then we also took the chemicals of World War II and used those to kill the insects that resulted from this new modern kind of farming, not the insects that resulted, the pressure of the insects and the pressure of the disease and pests. And then if you look at the graphs of gross income, farm income, so all the money that is made from farming, and then the money that the farmers made, basically since we invented fertilizer, farmers in the developed world have actually lost income in real terms. They make less money than they did then. Whereas big ag, as I call it, has just risen and risen and risen and risen in its proportion of what it's taking home of that industry. And a major player in that is, of course, Bayer, who now own Monsanto. Monsanto was the original big mover there. But you get to the situation now where the lion's share of the money from agriculture is made by the industrial agricultural complex, no different from the military industrial complex. And yeah, that is a massive industry. And here in Africa, I mean, they spend a lot of money every year trying to convince governments that the green revolution, which ain't green, and actually only really works with subsidies, needs to come to Africa to make Africa food secure, and to make Africa actually make farming a business, an economy growing entity rather than just a production of food entity. And they've been doing this for 15 years now or more, and the evidence is not in their favor. The food security has not increased anywhere where they have come in. And yeah, they are a very, very powerful, very rich lobby. I don't know if that's answered the question.
No, I think for me, certainly it has. Now, we have two that have come in next to each other, Liesel and Johan, and I'm going to ask them together because I think they do go together. I mean, and Liesel asked the question I asked. I mean, what would it take, or what would it cost the farmer to actually make this change, to become a regenerative soil farmer and to farm in a way that allows them to adopt a positive change to their yield trade-offs? I mean, what is inhibiting them? She's assuming that there are obstacles, but what are these obstacles? Are they just political?
No, I mean, a large part of it is human nature. Fear of change, fear of risk, and those are real. Farming. I mean, if you look at the economics model I know best is what I'd call your mixed maize farmer here in South Africa. So we're talking about a commercial farmer here, not a small scale farmer. And they produce maize and soyas on a rotation. So they've got that rotation going. And then they need to start introducing cover crops, and they need to introduce their animals back into their farm. And in some way, that whole process is a big leap of faith for a farmer to make, because although their farms are big businesses with big turnovers, the profit margins are quite small. And so if you make a mistake, you lose money. And most of the farmers owe debt on their land and debt on the seeds and fertilizer and diesel that they bought. And so as a result, they're very leveraged with debt, and that makes their risk even higher. And so in our research, we have discovered that a problem is that they don't have anyone to help them. So that we don't have, like, the chemical companies and the fertilizer companies pay reps to go out, and those reps kind of function as extension officers. They're not really extension officers, they're just selling their products. But they are the farmer's source of external information. And they tell the farmer, do this, this, and this on this nice recipe, and everything will work. Now, there's no one going farmer door to door selling a regenerative agriculture solution. And then if they go to the bank and say, look, I need to borrow X million rand to buy a regenerative or a no-till planter, and to buy livestock back onto my farm, because my father got rid of all the livestock because they didn't really make money and we didn't need them anymore because we had fertilizer. And to do all of that, I need X million rand, can you lend it to me? Now the banker looks at them and goes, well, I don't have a pile of Excel spreadsheets that tell me how to lend money to a regenerative farmer. So the banker goes like, well, I'm not allowed to be, breaking new ground, so sorry, I can't lend you any money. And then they're stuck. And so, yeah, it's a combination of all of those things. It's a combination of our education system. I'm talking specifically about our agricultural education system. If you graduate from an agricultural college in South Africa today, what you learn is really no different to what your father would have learned 30 years ago. It hasn't really changed. We think of industrial agriculture as leading edge science agriculture. Fertilizer is more than 100 years old, and Roundup, the primary chemical, is 75 years old. there's not rocket science, there's not new stuff. The cutting edge stuff is the biology we know, the relationship between plants and soil, and how those roots interact with those microbes, and the fungi and the bacteria, and how it all interlinks with each other. That is the stuff that's cutting edge knowledge. But not even conservation agriculture, which is kind of halfway to regenerative agriculture, not even that's properly taught in any of our agricultural colleges. So there's a big systemic failure that plays on human nature, on fear, and the fear of risk taking, and all of that comes together to make it very difficult for farmers to make that transition.
So there's a question from Robin Brown. In South Africa, we are seeing a lot more wildlife farming, some of it fairly intensive. For example, of impala and eland. Do you think this is a model that can be viably extended into other Southern African states? Would you see this as a positive step towards ecosystem services? If so, why is it not happening? Is it linked to ownership rights?
I'm fairly critical of a lot of wildlife farming that happens in South Africa. There's this magical belief that if you put wildlife on land, they know how to graze it, and they don't overgraze it. Well, we just got to go visit any of our reserves to know that's not the case. So they don't have any great understanding of grazing. They're just eating what they see in front of them, and so there is an issue there that we need to talk about. South Africa has a huge number of private game ranches, a lot of them based on hunting, I think, rather than actual primarily meat harvesting. And on a lot of those, there is very, 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 very poor felt condition. And that is something we need to engage with and discuss and get people to talk about. Then in terms of intensive animal production, whether those animals are wildlife or domestic, it really doesn't make a difference. It's not environmentally friendly, and it's going to deteriorate ecosystem services. And that is just a basic fact of jamming animals together. You're basically doing a feedlot system. And it doesn't matter if it's a cow or a buffalo or an eland. It's no more beneficial to the environment by it being a wild animal. So.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for that. Question from Sarah from the International Crane Foundation. My question is, how do we harmonize solutions to wildlife-human conflict whilst meeting the demands of the communities? We have had communities say you have suggested deterrent measures, but what if the losses we have already, but what of the losses we have already incurred? So, if there are losses due to regenerative farming or introducing conservation, how does one approach that? I can almost not, in the short term, maybe losses from regenerative agriculture, but in the long term, I don't imagine there being losses from regenerative agriculture as such.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest example is to take purely extensive livestock system. I mean, I know there are conservation bodies in South Africa that are collaring, for instance, leopards. And if a leopard is near an animal that is killed, they'll pay for that animal that was killed. Most of the time, the leopard is not near the animal that was killed. But often it's feral dogs and various other things that are to blame for the actual deaths. And I think that, there's been quite a bit of research done on this, on regenerative ranches around the world. A few farmers have decided they're just going to deal with the loss they make from predators and stop warring with predators. And there have been results where once a stability has returned to the local predator population, the impact of those predators has decreased. And once other wildlife, other trophic levels, and I think it's a very important thing that we need to understand is the whole trophic level, the food pyramid. And when we take various cornerstone species out of a food pyramid, it really does cause chaos. You know, I know a sheep farmer in the Karoo who 15 years ago stopped warring with jackals. And he now has stable jackal population on his farm. There are no transient jackals coming through his farm because there's a stable population there that have their territories and chase away other jackals. And he claims that he loses many fewer animals than his neighbors do. But there's no doubt that there is and there will be, this conflict. It's not something I specialize in. I'm really focusing on trying to get people to change the way they interact with their soil. In the process, I have come across a number of people who are dealing with this, and that's the things that I've learned from them. And yeah, I mean, you're probably better qualified than I am to answer this question.
I would like to mention, Sarah, that we've done a series of talks on this very subject earlier this year, and I will ask Maret to share the link to the human-wildlife conflict series that we've had so far, and we will probably return to that subject again, because you can almost, with every, definitely not call it problem animals, but you would with different predators, you would have the you can almost run a series on how to interact with different different animals, be it elephants, human-animal conflict, be it lions, leopards. There's a whole different approach and science and research being done on every animal. And also in different context in every African country. Whereas in South Africa, there are large parts where that kind of conflict doesn't exist anymore. It is much more common in other parts of Africa, and that's why we also take this series sort of country by country, because there's a different focus in every country where different problems exist. Sarah also mentioned, Andrew, and this might be closer to home for you, how can we introduce sustainable use of wetlands without completely swaying away from the practices they already do that bring them income and food? You also mentioned watersheds and the way that non-sustainable practices have affected South African watersheds.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the world, especially the sort of the drier parts of the world, we have really destroyed wetlands across the planet, and this is a massive impact on the water cycles, and a massive impact on desertification across all of the areas. And it's very important that we protect these areas, the few remaining ones we have left. And so here in South Africa, there's legislation that you can't drain a wetland and turn it into a mealie field. That's already existing legislation from the 70s. It still carries on. In terms of communities living in close conjunction with wetlands, it's once again, it's a very thorny and difficult issue. If you take, for instance, Lake St. Lucia and the problems that are happening around there, it's how do we deal with the fact that we have historically taken so much in terms of ecosystem services from the land, and how do we make it the problem of the people who are now interacting with the land that they have to be responsible for that on behalf of the entire population of the planet? And this is where I talk about the fact that I think we need ecosystem services. You can't, the 96%, you've got to pay the 3% that are interacting with the soil. And the 96%, if we have to pay the people of the wetland to stay out of the wetland in order that we can have a functioning wetland and a functioning hydrology, then we've got to get our heads around that and work out a way of doing it.
Mhm.
And that's what we've got to do. That becomes their business. That's the way they make a living, rather than from over harvesting. And I say over harvesting not because they're bad people or whatever. They're just, over time they're going to be more and more people, and we will over harvest. That is the nature of our story. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And the 96.5% need to find ways to pay for this. And the way I look at the whole regenerative ecosystem of South Africa, which is my focus. I mean, it applies anywhere, but different parts of the world think of regenerative agriculture slightly differently. I mean, I think we have two primary functions. We have to create pathways for farmers to move towards natural farming systems. And I mean multiple pathways, because there are multiple different kinds of farmers doing things different ways, and their context and their geography and their climate and everything all need to be taken into account. And then we also need to create pathways for the 96% to be able to invest in the restoration of land. We need to look at how do we turn the 600 million people who interact with the soil on the planet as farmers, how do we turn them into land restorers and farms? And the concept that this must be paid for by the 3% is really bizarre. It's got to be carried by the whole of society, because the whole of society depends on it.
Andrew, we spoke before the talk began about, and I'm just thinking, because you're now talking about the 96% has to pay the 3% to do the right thing on behalf of the 96%.
For half of the 100%.
Half of 100%. How do we make that happen without charging a premium price? Because you do not want regenerative practices to be a small minority thing being done for consumers of elite consumers. You want regenerative agriculture products to be available to everybody. Food should be healthy. Food should be healthy for the earth and the community that live among where the food is created. How do we do you have an idea on how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, one idea is ecosystem services. Paying for ecosystem services, I think, is definitely something that needs to be looked at more closely. There are a lot of people working around the world at the moment on. So we have a small growing agricultural carbon credit market, but there are people working on a biodiversity market. So looking at biodiversity on farms, is that biodiversity increasing? Is it decreasing? Do you have no spiders? All of those sort of things, and starting to take those things into account, and they become part of those ecosystem services. And we've got to look at that. We've also got to look, and this is something we focus on, because we can't change that whole thing as much as we'll try to, but it's part of a bigger conversation. We're trying to create those pathways for people to invest in restoration. You can't just shout at farmers and legislate against them and tell them they have to change the way they farm. Okay, that's not going to work. Go look at New Zealand, go look at Holland. It's not working, and it's going to work less well in Africa than it's working in New Zealand and Holland, where it's not working. And so, rather than just use whips, come along and go, okay, well, let's invest in this together. And we need to invest in the restoration, because we've got to come to the realization that the 100% can't survive without those ecosystem services. And so I think that's a very important thing to get right. A, the ecosystem services, and B, then finding ways of investing in the restoration of land. Because you actually can continue for a long time to have an economic stream of benefits from that land. Land that might have ended up becoming so desertified it couldn't produce a crop anymore, or couldn't produce sheep anymore. But if you restore it now, it can produce going into the future, and it can even, it doesn't have to be a donation. It can actually be an investment, and it can get money going forward for a 25-year investment in the restoration of this part of the planet. So I think those two things are crucial ways that we need to be working on creating that scenario, because we can't make food more expensive. That's not an option. People are struggling to buy food as it is.
Has Liesl Bennett, as a follow-up, I would ask what Regen AG, SA or other groups are doing to help farmers make the change?
Yeah, so I am part of a bigger group of companies, and we are creating courses, online courses, to start teaching people. We have people doing research. We've connected with a lot of people who've been doing research in conservation agriculture and connecting through into regenerative agriculture. We've also created a fund to invest in regenerative agriculture, to actually try and make happen what I was talking about, the 96% investing in the restoration of farms. And so we have started that. And then we're working closely with the various biological agronomists in the country, and starting to interact with them and their clients to find out what do those farmers need to either complete that journey or to start walking down that journey. And so we created an ecosystem of entities to play all of those various roles. And then we've created communities, social media communities for farmers to connect with each other, because one of the biggest complaints, if you look across the world, is regenerative farmers complaining that the nearest person to them who's trying to solve their problems in the same way that they are trying to solve them is hundreds of kilometers away. And they feel very isolated, and they go to the shop and they feel like people are talking about them, and they go to church and they feel like people are talking about them. And they feel isolated in their communities because they are saying, I'm doing this differently. And we don't like that as a species generally, when people say they're doing things differently from the way we're doing it. And so we've been working at creating communities, whether they're WhatsApp communities, Facebook communities, linking people together, and trying to get more stories out there. So yeah, it's a whole multifaceted approach that we're working on to move in this direction.
Would you mind sharing those apps or groups that you perhaps on Facebook, so that if anyone else would like to join one of those groups, then
yeah, I mean, if anyone in, the groups are generally geographically based. So, I don't want somebody from the Cape Winelands joining the Popo group, because it's going to be a waste of time.
Yeah.
They're talking about growing avos, and the guy in the Winelands, he ain't growing any avos. So if people want to join up, they can just contact me, and I will find out which is the most appropriate group for them to be involved in. And see if we haven't, and if we haven't got one, then let's start one, and we'll make a new one in your area or your crops or whatever it is. Yeah.
Thanks for this fabulous talk. I'm sitting here, and thinking, you and the organizations you work with, people you work with, are doing so much good, and this impacts the major portion, if I may say, of climate change. Are you getting support or anything like that from the government, maybe some departments in government?
No, we're not getting any support from government. I mean, government recognizes conservation agriculture. Government doesn't recognize organic agriculture, really. I mean, it says it does, but it doesn't. There's no paperwork to show that it does. And regenerative agriculture is a new conversation. We have done some work with the land bank, and we are still trying to interact with them. and hopefully that will take us somewhere. But as we all know, there are lots of problems there. And yeah, I mean, we're getting more input from, for instance, the Dutch government than our South African government at this stage of affairs. We will continue moving in that direction. I work very closely with the organic sector people. They are on a very long path with the government now, and it's been a very slow path. So
it's very sad. It's very sad, really, because it impacts the major part of what the government could be doing for its citizens,
Yeah, and it is something that needs to be dealt with at a government level. We have a situation where the only extension officers really in the country, if you're talking real numbers wise, are the representatives of chemical and fertilizer companies. There's no one representing the organic sector going around knocking on doors and whatever. They don't have the budget to do it. And the extension officers, government extension officers that I knew from my childhood, well, that whole department is kind of folded, and it has to be recreated. And we need to be going out to people. There's so few people actually in our country growing food, so few people, and it's something that our government should be working hard to come up with solutions for. But and I understand it's difficult. Can't overnight suddenly turn everyone back into farmers. The world moved. Our history happened. People were broken from their tie with farming, and now they need to be reintroduced to their tie with not farming, just production of food. And it's a lot of work that needs to be done. Unfortunately, there are amazing people in this country who have the knowledge and understanding and are prepared to share it. We just need to find mechanisms, and this is where we need governments to help us get that information out there, to help people, to hold their hands. But it is a massive, massive challenge.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to both Andrews. I would just like to mention that on the Regenerative Agriculture website, there are really a lot of resources, practical resources in terms of how to do it. Please visit the website. I'm pretty sure Marit has posted the link in the chat, but it's well worth a visit. And there are a lot of other farmers sharing their knowledge and their skills on YouTube as well. These days, as Andrew says, there are not a lot of people going to visit your farm promoting regenerative agriculture techniques, but on the internet, technology is your resource. Reach out, talk to people. People will reach out to you from all over the world. You'll be surprised at how willing people are in this industry to assist and to help. So yeah, there's quite a lot of amazing resources available out there. Well, I would also like to thank our audience joining really from all over Africa. I've seen people from Nigeria, from Kenya, Zimbabwe, and some famous people from the world of conservation, More Angels in Biza. Thank you very much for joining us. It's an honor to have you with us as well. And it's interesting to see how the world of conservation is reaching out to agriculture. There was a comment in the chat from a gentleman from the SA Wildlife College, where they are now developing a module on regenerative agriculture. So that's very encouraging as well. From that, then if it's not coming from the agricultural side, it might come from the conservation side. But somewhere we'll do it. We'll make a plan. Andrew, thank you very much for your work, and we looking forward to inviting you back in the future and doing a deeper delve into some of these, a deeper dive into some of these aspects of conservation or regenerative agriculture. Thank you for the information. Very, very valuable information is power, and I think awareness is also very, very helpful.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much for giving me a platform, and yeah, we need to be spreading this thinking as fast as we rapidly can.